Good morning. I am just doing a quick live. I'm about to do a day of training with the Lifestyle Suite this morning, which is awesome. The boys with their dads, so I've had a decent sleep. Hooray! And I feel like my brain's starting to settle down a little bit because I'm not being distracted every 5 seconds. So what I wanted to talk about really quickly was something. Oh, my glasses are fogging up. Following up on a quote that I mentioned from W.E.B. Du Bois the other day in the session I did on nationalism and the ideas behind nationalist or decolonising movements. So the quote was, "To be a poor man is hard, but to be a poor race in a land of dollars is the very bottom of hardship." And so the quote is talking about the ways in which class and race together combine to shape the experiences of people. The quote really, he was looking at the US at the time, at the start of the 20th century, and looking at the ways in which African Americans had been put into the category of a slave class, and that had restricted their movement upwards in society. They'd been denied economic advancement because of that, because they weren't getting paid. They were, the way that the system worked was that it confined people to a certain space. Hey, Kim, I am having a good morning. Thank you. Hope you are too. I'm just doing a bit of a history debrief after that one I did the other night, because I've had a great question about it. So the legislation and social practices that I'm talking about there's been a whole heap of government practices and also just the way that society works that has kept certain groups of people stuck in one place. And it's very hard for when those powers are operating for people to push past them. And so that's when you start to see people talking against it. That's one way in which people rebelled. And then there's also examples of resistance movements that are more kind of physical. Nat Turner's coming to mind as the first example in the US anyway, as an example of a rebellion against slavery and slave owners. But this is a system that was repeated around the world. So W.E.B. Du Bois, who I was talking about the other day, he was talking about the colour line, and I mentioned that Marilyn Lake and Henry Reynolds have talked about how that was continued around the world. And so there were legislation and social practices in just about everywhere that confine people. And it's not just a racial thing. Like, you can see the way that class operates. We talk a lot about it in Australia with the way that Centrelinks run and that sort of thing. People get categorised in a certain way. It's the same, like, it's just an added level. Banaka Tarisi Bula. I'm glad it's sunny there. I think we might get sun later, but it's been raining here. When I was doing my PhD, I was reading this guy, Mahmoud Mamdani, and he talked about practices of exclusion and inclusion. Hey, Ashley. And that I found was one of the most useful ways of thinking about it. So some people were included in systems or had access to power and had access to money, had access to just even the ability to build wealth, whereas others were not. Others were excluded from that process. And he was looking at Africa in particular. He's done work on Rwanda and the conflict that happened there in the 90s. So, this is what I mean. Like, these ideas and practices are not just isolated to one place. These are like global phenomena that keep happening over and over again. And this is why history is so useful to know about, because you can see the way power, class, race continue to shape people's experiences. In Australia, one of the best examples are that in the 1800s, legislation was being set up that was specifically for Aboriginal people. So there was a system set up based on people's race or ideas of what race was, and classified people that way. And that those legislative systems denied people access to wealth. It pushed people onto reserves, so they were excluded from mainstream Australian society. That was created through the process of colonisation, mainstream for want of a better word. And then often on the reserves, people were not paid wages, depending on where they were, missions as well. So, hey, James, I'm just talking about the processes of inclusion and exclusion that I talked about in my thesis a little bit more, because I'm following up on a quote that I mentioned from W.E.B. Du Bois the other day. So this might actually be helpful, maybe, but you'll probably be all over it anyway. What else was I going to say? Often the legislation with regards to reserves and missions and the practices that happen there would push people into agricultural or industrial types of work. So often on reserves here, it was agriculture. Richard Broome is a historian whose work I've used a lot to teach this in Victoria. So he looked at Corandurk in particular, a mission near Hillsville, and they were farming hops and had a whole huge system going on for farming. So in that case, I mean, there were examples where on missions people were able to start raising revenue, and there was talk and even promise of economic enhancement and movement, and trying to get a bit more independence and autonomy. But often what happened with Corandurk and in a whole heap of other places, the government would then come in and undermine that, or the neighbours to the reserves or the local community would undermine those efforts. So there's both the legislation operating to kind of put people in a box, and then society. I mean, the legislation was reflecting society anyway. This is where it's getting complicated. But there were many kind of factors that would push people into these categories and keep people stuck or undermine their potential to get ahead. So that's what I think. That's kind of a bit more of an explanation about how, when W.E.B. Du Bois is talking about to be a poor man is hard, but to be a poor race in a land of dollars is the very bottom of hardship, you can see how in colonies, places where they were colonised, where people were colonised, that people were excluded from any of the wealth that was being generated. And it's in this very capitalistic industrial system where wealth is defined in a certain way too. So the places are rich in so many ways, right? But then with Europeans coming in, they look to certain things to trade for money, and then those systems have then operated to redefine the way that wealth operates, and then you've got those processes that exclude people from accessing it. I think I've talked myself around in a bit of a circle, but hopefully that kind of made sense. I'm happy to go through it, and I'll do a transcript later. I've got this huge day of training, so I think I finish at 4, and then I'll try and spend some time tonight writing this out into a blog or something like that. Especially if people are interested. But I was thrilled that someone followed up with me, someone very important to me. So I'm glad that I've been able to talk about it a little bit more. There's so much more I can talk about with regards to nationalism and independence movements and stuff. So I'll keep. Thanks, Michael. I'm just reading your message. I just got a message come through from Michael, who I went to primary school with. Was creating a compounding issue when combined with the conditions and social one. Yeah, I can't seem to open up the rest of your message, but I think from the start of what you've said, maybe I did make sense, which is promising. Yeah, but there's lots of factors that come together, to to shape the way we are. So the thing that I'm finding interesting too now is learning from those historical examples of power, control, legislation, construction, social movement kind of things. You know, thinking about that and looking at the way that the government's reacting to the coronavirus, how the rest of us are reacting to the coronavirus, that sort of thing. It's another example of all that. And then the trickle-down impacts on class and race and how that's being talked about too, I think are important to be critical and analytical of as we go through this next phase. So you made sense. Oh, thank goodness. Thanks, Michael. If you ever want to ask me questions or if I've gone too much into academic mode, just ask, because I'm trying really hard. And part of the training I'm doing today is about me talking to a bigger audience, because I don't want to just be talking to academics anymore. That's where I'm at with my work. I want to be talking to a big audience because, there's important discussions to be had. All right, I better have a cup of tea and some toast before I get onto this work. And, I hope you all have a good day. Hopefully the weather is nice so you can get outside for a little bit and have some fresh air. And, I'll see you soon. Bye.